Friday, September 12th, 2025, 5 in the evening. The granite wall of the Piliers Cordillère on the Grande Charmeuse, the Mont Blanc Massif. 5 men on the last rappel station. 4 instructors from the finest mountain guide school in Europe, and an officer of the High Mountain Gendarmerie. A routine, revolting job. The final rappel. This is exactly where Christophe Jacquemoud falls, 52 years old, professor at ENSA, a member of the Compagnie de Guide de Chamonix since 2003. A man who spent 20 years teaching future guides how not to fall on descents. 4 colleagues watch everything from 2 meters away and can do absolutely nothing. How could the teacher of all teachers fall on a rappel that he himself had explained to students 1,000 times? Here is what happened. Christophe Jacquemoud comes into the world on February 24, 1973, in Salanches, a small town right at the foot of the Mont Blanc Massif. His family lives not in town, but higher up, in the village of Saint-Nicolas-de-Véros, tucked into a fold of the mountain above Saint-Gervais. From the windows of the house, you see not the neighbors' roofs, but the walls and glaciers, where adult guides head at 4 in the morning with backpacks on their shoulders. For a child growing up in such a landscape, the mountain is not a fairy tale backdrop. It is the nearest neighbor, one you have to reckon with every single day. Christophe puts on his first skis before he learns to read. The slopes above the village become his playground, which he studies in summer and in winter. He learns to set his edges, to fall without fear, to look at snow and understand how yesterday's crust differs from today's. Parents and neighbors treat it as an ordinary matter. Everyone grows up this way here. In those years, the valley is quietly changing. Glaciers are retreating, old trails are being washed out. Rock falls on the classic routes happen more often than in the previous generation. Tourists grow more numerous, while the massif itself behaves ever more capriciously. The adult climbers whom Christophe overhears in the village bar discuss this without drama, the way people discuss the weather. Boys from villages like this split early into 2 groups. Some leave for the city, trade the mountains for an office, and return only on weekends. Others stay and grow into the slopes. Christophe belongs from the very start to the second group. For him, the mountain is not a job. It is a language he learns to speak before all other languages. Already as a teenager, he goes out with local guides, quietly watching how they handle the rope, how they build a belay station, how they answer clients' questions. Later, people will see in him the most important quality of a guide, the attention to the details that in the mountains cost lives. This attention to detail and calm in his behavior gradually become his style. As a teenager, Christophe tries everything the Massif has to offer. Rock in summer, ice in early spring, ski descents almost year-round. He is not chasing a name, he is not collecting trophies, but his name gradually begins to surface in the conversations of his elders. They speak of him as a guy who does not shout on a wall and does not argue with a route. By the end of his 20s, he makes a decision that, in French mountain villages, changes an entire destiny. The mountains stop being only a passion and become a profession. In France, this is a long and demanding path. To become a mountain guide, one must go through ENSA, the National School of Skiing and Mountaineering in Chamonix. It trains every professional guide in the country and is considered one of the hardest schools in the world of mountaineering. Before the school itself, there is a long filter. The candidate must compile his own list of ascents with specific routes and grades. Each ascent is verified, each route is assessed. The entrance exams test not only rock and ice technique, but also speed, endurance, and behavior in a team. Elimination at every stage is a normal thing, and no one takes offense at it. Christophe works his way through the process stubbornly. He climbs the classic lines of the Mont Blanc Massif, travels to neighboring ranges, tries himself in different styles. In 2002, he receives his mountain guide's diploma. A year later, in 2003, he is admitted to the Compagnie de Guide de Chamonix, the oldest guide association in all the Alps, founded back in the 19th century. In the valley, joining the Compagnie means more than an entry in a register. It is recognition that a person knows how to work in the mountains and how to conduct himself around other people. Here, respect is earned not in words, but through routes and conduct in difficult situations. For Christophe, this is not the finish line, but the start. Now, he has access to the most serious work, and the rest of his career will be built on this foundation. The guide's diploma opens professional doors for him, but his heart remains where it all began, on skis. In the Mont Blanc Massif, Christophe quickly becomes known above all as a steep slope skier. This is a special, separate discipline where mistakes are not forgiven at all. On a slope of 45, 50 degrees, there is no backup plan. Either you ski the line clean, or you do not get a second try. He chooses exactly those lines. Couloirs that in the valley people point at from the terraces of cafes are for him ordinary working descents. Friends all say the same thing about him. Christophe has an exceptional sense of the mountain. He reads the snow, the slope, the wind, the light, and in a second he can tell whether to go today or not. In the world of steep skiing, that is the main currency. The technique is similar for everyone, but only a few know when to turn back in time. In one of the seasons, he finishes second at the Derby de la Meige. This is a mass start speed descent from the summit of La Meige in the Alps, where hundreds of the strongest skiers in the world come to the start. Second place in such a field is elite level for his era. For Christophe, it is no cause for publicity, but confirmation that the years of training have paid off. He does not limit himself to his own descents. In Chamonix, he coaches young skiers, takes them onto steep slopes, and explains how to assess avalanche danger. He passes on a simple principle: look for yourself, think for yourself, leave the camera in the pack. His attitude to social media is well known in the valley. He almost never posts, he does not run accounts, he does not turn his work into a showcase. To the young he repeats one phrase: focus on your skis, not on the camera. This stance defines how he is viewed in the valley. In a world where every second guide is posting stories straight from the route, a quiet professional draws even more respect. The quiet professional with skis gradually moves into another genre, where mistakes cost not seconds, but minutes, hours, and days of consequences. From steep descents, Christophe moves naturally to the big classic routes of the Mont Blanc Massif. He climbs the walls of the Aiguille du Midi, the south face of the Aiguille du Fou, the lines on Mont Blanc itself. This is no list for the sake of a list. Each route takes weeks of preparation, demands total focus on the wall, and the habit of solving problems as a rope team. In his record appears the Colton McIntyre on the north face of the Grandes Jorasses. This route in French mountaineering is considered the benchmark of alpine style. A long mixed line, ice, rock, shifting weather, a long exit. Whoever climbs it clean earns an internal stamp of quality within the community. Christophe climbs it without turning it into a PR occasion. In this same period, he does a great deal of work on serious ice lines of the Massif and neighboring ranges, including such walls as La Lyre, a long ice route that in its day was considered one of the hardest in the world. Such lines demand a rare combination of strength, technique, and calm at the critical moment. When thin vertical ice is under your feet and the next belay is 40 meters above, a nervous person simply will not make it. Colleagues note precisely this calm in him. He does not rush on a difficult section, does not turn it into a race, knows when to turn back quietly in the face of bad ice. He does not chase easy points, does not give loud interviews, does not appear in magazines. For him, style is not image, but discipline from the beginning of the route to its end. In the climbing community, such a stance is valued higher than any loud words. Young guides increasingly turn to Christophe for advice. He does not brush anyone off. He will answer a question about a belay, a question about gear, a question about climbing tactics. This openness gradually earns him the reputation of a man you can ask anything in the mountains. A man who can be asked anything sooner or later ends up on the other side of the desk. His reputation as a strong climber and skier leads Christophe logically to ENSA, the National School of Skiing and Mountaineering. In Chamonix, everyone knows this building. From its walls come all the country's professional mountain guides, and inside, specific instructors are responsible for each student's success. Christophe begins working at the school around 2007 or 2008. His first department is the ski program. He teaches technique, tactics, work in difficult conditions, risk assessment, and team behavior. In his classroom sit, not beginners, but adult candidates for guide certification. These are people who already ski at a very high level and have come for the final polishing. His task is not to teach them to ski, but to teach them to think on the slope. A few years later, he is moved to the mountaineering department. For the school, this is a natural move. He himself has traveled the path from skis to big routes and can pass both sides of the profession to his students. From 2014 to 2018, Christophe coordinates the work of the entire mountaineering department. This is an administrative load, scheduling, exams, but he treats it with the same seriousness as his own ascents. Colleagues describe him as a demanding instructor. He dislikes superficial decisions, does not accept answers along the lines of, "That's how it's usually done." In a route debrief, Christophe asks uncomfortable questions. Why did you go here and not there? What did you see in the snow when you made the decision? What did your partner say? And why did you not hear him? He is interested not in technique for its own sake, but in the mechanisms by which people make decisions in the mountains. He teaches future guides to think as a rope team, to talk to each other, not to be afraid to admit a mistake, and to turn a group back in time. Students leave his classroom with one common impression. Christophe does not drill you, he tunes your head. The rest, in his words, the mountain will do on its own. The mountain teaches its own lessons, but students receive that tuning of the head precisely from instructors like this. Over the years at ENSA, dozens of future guides from all over France and neighboring countries pass through Christophe's hands. They leave the school with his principles: attention to detail, responsibility for your partner, simplicity of technique, distrust of elegant solutions. These rules later work for them in different ranges, in the Alps, in the Pyrenees, on distant expeditions. The director of ENSA will later describe Christophe's calling in a single word: to pass on. That one word explains a great deal. He is not interested in the title of star climber. What matters to him is that a person who left his classroom is leading a client up Mont Blanc 2 years later, and not making unnecessary mistakes. The president of the Compagnie de Guide will later describe him as an exceptional, very precise, and very accessible professional. In life, he does not come across as a heavy figure at all. Christophe is a man with humor, sensitive, curious about the most varied things, from music to engineering. In a general conversation, he readily switches from a question about climbing tactics to the discussion of a new book or ordinary village news. This simplicity teaches his students by itself. A professional can be strong without playing a role. He has 2 children at home, Ninon and Ulysses. They grow up in the same valley where he himself took his first steps on skis. It matters to Christophe that they see a living father, not just a man in a magazine article. He takes part in the local life of Saint Nicolas de Vérossé, does not hide behind the status of guide and instructor, talks calmly with neighbors in the shop. For his students, he is not a star, but an older brother. You can go to such a person with any question, with a silly one, with a personal one, with a professional one. No one is afraid of being laughed at. This personal closeness to people will later become one of the main details in how colleagues, students, and neighbors will speak about him. The way people will later speak about Christophe cannot be understood without the scenery in which he works his whole life. This whole story plays out against the backdrop of Europe's principal massif, Mont Blanc, the most visited high mountain on the continent. It is visible from Geneva, its straight cone rises directly above Chamonix, and every summer tens of thousands of people come to the valley. Tourists, runners, skiers, climbers, clients of guides. They want a brief touch with the mountain, but the mountain remains itself regardless of how many visitors come. By various estimates, around 100 people die each year on the approaches and routes of the entire massif. Part of these cases is simple underestimation of conditions. Not enough clothing, too late a start, no experience on ice. Most often, tragedies happen on the classic route through the Gouter Couloir. In the valley, it has long had a grim reputation. Rocks fall regularly there, and in summer, tourists cross that zone in helmets, trying to catch a brief lull between rock falls. The massif has been behaving more and more unpredictably in recent years. With warming climate, glaciers retreat faster, permafrost in the rock is thawing. Stones and ice come down more often and in unusual seasons. Old routes that 2 generations of guides considered reliable are now growing more dangerous. Fragile rock unexpectedly splits in places that once held entire groups. ENSA, CNEAS, PG, HM, and other bodies constantly reassess the routes in the massif. Part of the classic lines have in recent years been declared too risky for commercial groups. The list of permitted routes grows shorter. Requirements for clients grow stricter. Christophe, As an instructor at the school and a working guide, sees these changes from the inside with his own eyes. He has been climbing the same walls for decades and notices every new shift. It is he who tells his students why they cannot trust an old guidebook and must look at the actual wall. His lessons gradually become a reflection of this new, more nervous massif, where familiar routes call for reassessment. These routes cannot simply be closed. Climbers and clients of guides have used them for decades. In response to the new risks, the state mountaineering bodies launch a program to reinforce the routes. ENSA works hand-in-hand with the PGHM, CNISAG, and CNEAS, renewing rappel stations on the classic lines of the massif. The logic is simple. On a wall, there are belay stations from which rope is hung for descent. These are metal anchors driven into the rock and slings connecting them. Over time, the metal rusts, the slings stretch. Old pitons become unreliable. The goal of the program is to systematically replace outdated anchors with fresh, tested ones capable of handling modern loads. Such work is done by small teams of experienced instructors and officers of the High Mountain Gendarmerie. For Christophe, missions like these are familiar working routine, part of his teaching load. He goes out on rebolting work not once and not twice per season. For a professional at his level, working with stations is the most basic of operations. Secure the rope, descend, inspect the anchor, replace the sling, move lower, and so on, down to the ground. Everything is done in a strict protocol, step by step. There are hundreds of classic routes on the massif, and each needs periodic inspection. The work goes on for years. Routes are covered in sequence. The plan for the 2025 season includes several lines on the Aiguille de Chamonix, that very ridge of needle-like summits that rises right above the valley. One of the lines on the list is the Pilier Cordillère on the Grande Charmeuse. This is a large granite wall about 650 meters long, opened in 1970 as a classic alpine route. Grade 5C on the French system. Overall rating TD. The route runs through a system of cracks and inside corners, split by a large terrace. Stations are set all along it, and the descent from the summit is usually done by rappels on the route itself. Such a descent requires reliable anchors on every rope length. That is exactly why the Pilier Cordillère ends up on the rebolting plan for this autumn. And on September 12th, 2025, on a Friday, a team of 5 heads out onto the Grande Charmeuse. In the group are Christophe Jacquemoud and 3 other ENSA instructors. The 5th member is an officer of the PGHM, the Chamonix High Mountain Gendarmerie. The composition is not accidental. Rebolting classic routes is considered a task of heightened responsibility. So the team combines the school's expertise with the competencies of the gendarmerie. This is a working day, not a sport ascent. No one is going for a record, no one is racing the clock. Everyone moves on a familiar, tested schedule. The route is known to all 5. The team is prepared. The gear has been checked in advance. On this day, the weather in the massif is stable, visibility good. In the mountains, such a combination is a gift. They climb the Pilier Cordillère, working in rope teams. On the way up, they inspect the existing stations, noting what needs to be replaced. This is methodical work, where the important thing is not to rush. Each station is checked by hand. Carabiners, slings, pitons, everything is judged by eye and by feel. Old components are removed, new ones are set in their place. By midday, the team completes the main part of the task. The top of the route is behind them. All the planned anchors have been renewed. The descent down the same Pilier Cordillère begins. The descent is structured as a series of consecutive rappels. The rope is threaded through the station, the first person descends, then the others. Then the rope is pulled down, and the cycle repeats at the next anchor. There are about 14 such cycles on this route. The day gradually leans toward evening. The 5 come down the wall smoothly, without delays. The work is nearly done. One station remains, the final stretch before the place where they can take off their gear and head down to the valley. Around 5 in the evening, the group reaches the very last anchor on the descent. This is the final rappel of the route. For a team that has already spent the entire daylight hours on the wall, it looks like a closing formality. Almost all the tasks have been ticked off. At this last station, Christophe prepares to descend first. This is often what the most experienced member of a rope team does. He goes ahead to check the anchor from below to see how the rope runs, and if needed, to adjust the line for the others. For an ENSA instructor, this is an ordinary position. He fixes the rope to the station, feeds it through the descender, checks the system on himself. Harness, carabiner, device, knot, everything that is drilled at the school through thousands of repetitions. 4 colleagues stand nearby, on the same ledge, literally a couple of meters from one another. Everyone sees everyone. Everyone hears every movement. This is precisely the situation in which nothing unexpected should happen. At some moment during the maneuver with the rope, a failure occurs. The exact cause will be the subject of the investigation. What exactly gave way, the gear, the anchor, the load, the body position, cannot be reconstructed in that second. For the 4 beside him, the event compresses into a fraction of an instant. Christophe falls from the wall in front of 4 people. They see everything and can do nothing. Between him and the foot of the wall, there is a great height, and no movement at that moment can change the outcome. Later, in their statements, they will describe the shock as paralyzing. In a situation like this, professional training helps with only one thing. You do not close your eyes, and you do not run. But you do not change anything either. The PGHM officer acts quickly. He reports the incident by radio, assesses the group's position, moves it into a safe mode. The 4 remaining hold at the station, awaiting instructions. A helicopter of the High Mountain Gendarmerie rises over the massif, looking for an evacuation point. The helicopter takes the 4 colleagues down to the valley. They do not manage to recover Christophe from the foot of the wall that same evening. The weather worsens toward night, and the evacuation has to be postponed until the morning of the next day. On Saturday morning, the weather calms somewhat. MGGHM rescuers climb up to the foot of the Pilier Cordier. They complete the evacuation. In parallel, an investigation is opened. It is handled by the PGHM of Modane and the Gendarmerie Division of Chambéry. The task of the inquiry is simple and very difficult at the same time. To understand what exactly happened with the rope, the device, and the station at the moment when a routine maneuver ended in a fall, the news spreads through the valley in an instant. For Chamonix, a death like this is an event of enormous scale. Here in the mountains, someone gets into trouble every season, and deaths on routes have long stopped being a surprise. But this time, the one who goes is not a random client, not an inexperienced tourist, and not a loner who overestimated his strength. The one who goes is an ENSA instructor, a man who himself taught others how not to fall on descents. The director of ENSA, Manuel Brissot, gives a brief public statement. He speaks of a man whose calling was to pass on knowledge, of an instructor who was accessible and attached to his students. Olivier Greber, president of the Compagnie de Guides de Chamonix, calls Christophe an exceptional professional, a great skier of steep slopes, very precise and very open to people. In Saint-Nicolas-de-Véros, his home village, neighbors remember a quiet, calm man, always ready to help. He was visible in local life, took part in meetings, talked with people in the shop, drove children to school. For the village, he was not a famous guide off a magazine cover, but one of their own, a man of the village. In the climbing community down the valley, people begin to repeat a single phrase that appeared in the first news notes. He left doing what he loved. This formulation does not try to soften the loss. It simply states what everyone knows about Christophe. The mountains and skis were for him not a profession in the ordinary sense, but a way of life. He leaves behind 2 children, Ninon and Ulysses, and many years of students around the world, for whom his name is now tied to one specific wall. Christophe's name becomes fixed to that specific wall, but the blow to ENSA does not end on Friday, September 12th. 6 days later, the school loses 2 more instructors. On September 18th, 2025, Benjamin Guiganet and Quentin Lombard die in a car accident in the Verdun Gorge. Guiganet is 37, a laureate of the Piolet d'Or of 2018 for the south face of Nuptse as part of a French rope team. Lombard is 34, a guide and ski instructor from Pralognan-la-Vanoise, a colleague of Christophe at the school. The school in Chamonix finds itself in deep mourning. 3 instructors in 1 week is something ENSA has not known for a long time. For a small professional circle, this is more than statistics. These are concrete people with whom, just yesterday, You had coffee in the school kitchen and discussed autumn plans. Internally, questions remain both about Christophe's death and about the safety of the work on the classic routes. Rebolting anchors looks like routine, but it is precisely in routine that professionals most often make mistakes. A long day on the wall, repeated performance of the same motion, fatigue by the end of the shift. The investigation on the Grand Charmoz is checking every element separately: carabiners, the station, the sling, the descender, the knot, the body position at the moment of the fall. A separate review is being conducted within ENSA and the Compagnie de Guide de Chamonix. At the same time, the school and the gendarmerie do not halt the program of route reinforcement. The work is carried on by other teams, because the Massif demands attention anyway. In the conversations of colleagues, the thought emerges that the Pilier-Cordier route is now linked forever with Christophe's name. For the Chamonix Valley, this story leaves one main meaning: even the best of teachers are not safe from a final mistake. The mountain makes no exceptions, not for a beginner, not for an instructor of the school. That is exactly why every student who walked out of his classroom now carries his lessons further. The name of Christophe Jacquemoud becomes part of the rules that in Chamonix continue to be taught to the next generation of guides. 30 years in the mountains, years of father and daughter climbing together, and one morning on the Aiguille de Bionnassay, after which neither of the two will come back. On the 19th of July, 2025, the bodies of Pierre Poirot, a math teacher from the Vosges, and his 24-year-old daughter Elia, a medical student, are found at the foot of a 4,000er in the Mont Blanc Massif. They were on one of the most technical routes in the Alps. They had prepared for it seriously. A rope team that had been built for decades vanishes in a single second on a narrow ridge. How does an experienced father and his grown daughter end up at a point from which there is no coming back? There are rope teams that form for a single expedition, and there are those that are built over decades. Pierre Poirot and his daughter Elia were exactly the second kind. The father was 56, the daughter 24. They came from tiny Étival-Clairefontaine, a town in the Vosges in eastern France, where green hills, old factory chimneys, and the forest begin right behind the last houses. This is not the Alps. This is a quiet corner, and the people who have once tasted real altitude travel from here to the high mountains for the rest of their lives. Pierre had been climbing for more than 30 years. Elia had been going to the mountains with him since her school days. For them, a rope team was not gear and not a sporting term. It was a way of being close. On Saturdays, during school holidays, on vacation, on the trail, on the glacier, on the rope. While one family drives to the sea, another one, this one, drives to Chamonix. On the 19th of July, 2025, they are found at the foot of the Aiguille de Bionnassay, one of the satellites of Mont Blanc, a peak 4,052 meters above sea level, in the early morning. Down below, in a place where climbers don't go on the route itself, in a zone you only reach after a fall from the ridge. The family raised the alarm the evening before, when the check-in call that always came through didn't come. Rescuers from the Chamonix, PGHM, the elite mountain gendarmerie unit, move up the route in the dark. By dawn, the picture is already clear. The official version of the investigation is short: probable fall from the ridge. A rocky and snowy ridge, narrow, in places only a boot width across. A route that French guides describe as rather technical and demanding significant experience. Pierre and Elia had that experience. Their family rope team was one of those that are built over decades. And that is the main pain of this story. Experience didn't save them. Experience didn't save them. To understand why they had that experience in the first place, you have to go back 700 kilometers northwest of Mont Blanc, to the Vosges, to Étival-Clairefontaine, a town on the Meurthe River with a population of around 2,000. Tourists don't come here. There's the old paper industry, red roofs, a church spire, factory buildings, and the forest that begins right past the bridge. The Vosges are not the Alps. The highest point of the range, the Grand Ballon, rises just above 1,400 meters. By alpine standards, that's not much. But these mountains have their own role. They are a laboratory, a school. People come here who will later travel to Chamonix, to the Dolomites, to Mont Blanc. Here they learn to read the terrain, to place a foot, to haul a pack up through a wet forest, to navigate in fog. The Vosges give you the base on which altitude is later built. A strong culture of mountaineering clubs has long existed in this region. Small towns run their own sections. Schools have classes with mountain trips. PE teachers lead hikes, local enthusiasts lead climbs. Some people go once a season, some every weekend. Pierre Poirot grew up exactly in this environment. For him, the forest behind the house, the climb up a wet path, and a night in a mountain hut were part of everyday life, not an exotic adventure. Since childhood, he watched neighbors leave on Saturdays with packs. He saw teachers at the lycée coming back on Monday with windburned faces. He understood that moving in the mountains was a normal way of living, not a rare adventure. It is here, between the Vosges forest and the nearest trails, that the man takes shape who will later bring his own daughter into the mountains. The story doesn't begin on Mont Blanc. It begins here. The story begins here, between the Vosges forest and the weekend trails. In his youth, Pierre chose a clear professional line for himself: mathematics, dry, logical, demanding. He planned to go into teaching, to build a long, predictable life as a school teacher. That choice would stay with him for 30 years. But parallel to the textbooks and lesson plans, a second line appears in Pierre's life: the mountains. First, the Vosges. Weekend routes, forest, limestone ridges, the first nights under the open sky. Then the Alps, Chamonix, Courmayeur, the classic areas of the French and Italian Alps. His first serious climbs. He sees glaciers up close, learns to move on snow, tries ice. Mountaineering in those years is not a scheduled sport for him, but a systematic, multi-year school. He learns to work with a rope. He learns to walk in crampons. He gets to grips with setting belays, with using the ice axe, with reading terrain. He comes to understand how a mountain changes depending on the time of day, the season, last week's snowfall. None of this can be taken from books. It accumulates only in field practice, climb after climb. He goes out with partners of different levels, sometimes as the second, following those more experienced, sometimes leading novices himself on simple routes. Little by little, he becomes a man you can rely on. Someone drives to Chamonix for the weekend, but for Pierre, it has been running in the background of his entire life for decades. 30-plus years is not a figure in a biography. It's a huge amount of hours on the rope, on ridges, in huts, in rain, and in sun. It's a man who is no longer an amateur, but not a commercial guide either, an experienced, careful, systematic alpinist. That is exactly what Pierre becomes by the time his daughter is growing up in the family. Like this, systematic and mature, Pierre joins the Lycée Beaumont. This is a lycée in Saint-Dié-de-Vosges, a town 10 minutes drive from Étival-Clairefontaine. Students from all over the area come here. Pierre gets a job here as a math teacher, and from that moment on his school biography begins, stretching out over nearly 30 years. For his students, he is a teacher for the whole cycle, someone who is remembered for more than a single year. Math with Pierre is a subject that demands consistency, patience, precision, the same qualities as in the mountains. Colleagues describe him as a calm, methodical man who doesn't raise his voice and doesn't make sudden moves. In the school corridor, he looks exactly the way he probably looked on a ridge, restrained and sure of himself. Alongside school, he has another role. He becomes president of the local mountaineering club in the Vosges. This isn't a formal position. It's daily work. Organize an outing, sort out the gear, run a training session, keep an eye on a beginner who still can't reliably hold a rope, keep the records, plan the seasons. A special initiative of his is the school Parcours de Santé, a fitness trail, a marked route for pupils where they can train outdoors. Pierre designs it himself as a teacher's project, understanding that movement and endurance are as much a part of growing up as mathematics. The people who know him from school describe one person. The people who know him from the club, the same one. That is rare. Usually people have a work mask and a personal one. Pierre doesn't. He is the same in the classroom and on the trail. It is this wholeness that makes him a noticeable figure in town. And it is this that gets passed on to his daughter. This wholeness gets passed on. And the first heir to it is Elia, the younger daughter in the family. She grows up in a home where the gear doesn't sit in a closet for once a year, but in the hallway, because on Friday evening, the father is off to a climb. For a child, that is the normal landscape. Ice axes, helmets, ropes, the same household objects as plates and jackets. In her teenage years, Pierre starts taking her with him. First, simple routes, a forest path, a low ridge, a short via ferrata. He doesn't do it as a tourist with a child on vacation. He does it as a coach who knows that the mountains do not forgive gaps in the foundation. And so, Elia's base is laid from the very beginning, properly. Elia learns to handle a rope. She learns to set a foot on rock. She learns to work in crampons on snow and ice. She learns to read terrain and to plan movement. Her father shows her not tricks, but a system. How to tie a knot so it won't come undone by accident. How to approach a crevasse and where exactly to stop. How to tell that the snow has stopped holding. The most important thing he gives her is rhythm, breathing, step, rest. The ability to move for hours and not burn out in the first hour. The ability not to rush when you're tired. The ability to trust your partner and to know that your partner trusts you. For Elia, the mountains never become a vacation. They become part of the family language. A way of talking to her father without words, on the rope. A way of being close, even when they both are silent. This is not a teenager's hobby that passes with age. This is something that grows in and stays. It grows in and stays, even when Elia makes her own professional choice. After school, she enters the medical faculty. Medicine in France is a long road. 6 years of general training, specialization, residency. A huge workload, endless exams, hospital rotations, evening sessions in the anatomy building. By the age of 24, Elia is already in an advanced stage of this path. She is preparing to become a doctor, a person who will work with other people's lives, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, surgery. A huge body of knowledge that demands discipline, memory, a clear head. The same qualities you need on a serious alpine route, the same basic setup as her mathematician fathers. Consistency, accuracy, attention to detail. Her studies in the mountains run in parallel. On weekends, trips to the Alps. During holidays, serious routes. She doesn't become a professional athlete, doesn't chase records, doesn't seek fame, but she grows as a climber. The routes gradually become harder. Glaciers appear, long ridges, classic alpine routes. By 24, Elia is no longer the girl her father leads up a simple path. She is a partner, a full one, capable of carrying her share of responsibility on the rope. Pierre trusts her with key decisions, knows how she moves, knows her limits and her strengths, and she knows him the same way. At this point, they are a rare configuration, not a commercial guide with a client, not a coach with a student, not just a parent and a child. This is an adult rope team of 2 climbers bound by blood, by a decade of shared experience, and by the very same understanding of what to do in a tight spot. It is with this baggage that they come to the summer of 2025. With this baggage, they come to the summer of 2025, and to the Mont Blanc Massif, the most visited mountain region in Europe. This massif has a special role in European culture. Modern mountaineering was born here. The first ascent of Mont Blanc in 1786 was the starting point of an entire discipline. The first guides appeared here, the first huts, the first rescue services. Since then, Mont Blanc has turned into a mountain to which people travel every summer from all over the planet. Chamonix is the capital of the Massif, a small alpine town whose streets in July are packed with people in plastic boots and helmets. Experienced alpinists come here, and clients of commercial expeditions, and tourists on the cable cars. Every year, the Massif receives hundreds of thousands of people in different formats, from walks to glaciers to heavy technical routes. The flip side of this accessibility is the statistics. Mont Blanc is one of the deadliest mountains in Europe. Every summer, dozens of people die in the Massif. Falls from ridges, rockfall in couloirs, crevasses on glaciers, high-altitude pulmonary edema, hypothermia. The toll is not counted in exceptional cases, but in regular bulletins. The Chamonix PGHM, Peloton de Gendarmerie de Haute Montagne, works year-round. It is a specialized unit with a helicopter and specialists used to altitude and complex terrain. In summer, their call-outs number in the dozens each month. The main route to the summit runs via the Gutter. Classic, logistically well-worked, busy. Most people go up this way. But the Massif also has alternative routes. They are longer, more serious, more technical. Fewer people use them, but retreating from them costs more too. These are the routes chosen by those who care not just about a tick mark saying climbed Mont Blanc, but about the real mountain quality of the journey. Pierre and Elia choose exactly such a route. Pierre and Elia choose the Aiguille de Bionnassay, 4,052 meters above sea level. This is a peak in the southwestern part of the Mont Blanc Massif, one of its satellites. At first glance, a lesser mountain, lower than Mont Blanc, less loud in name. In reality, one of the most beautiful and, at the same time, most serious summits of the area. Its distinctive feature is the ridge, a long, narrow snow and ice ridge that connects the Aiguille de Bionnassay to the Dôme de Goutet and continues on to Mont Blanc itself. It is along this ridge that the alternative route to the main summit of the Massif runs. Guidebooks often describe it in a single phrase, one of the most beautiful traverses in the Alps, and at the same time, one of the most demanding. The Bionnassay ridge in places narrows to the width of a boot, a steep slope on one side, another steep slope on the other. A snow and ice blade along which you must walk in crampons, on the rope, with a clear head and good breathing. A mistake on such terrain rarely leaves a chance for a second try. The terrain around the ridge is missing natural points where a fall can be arrested, and that makes the route one of the most unforgiving in the area. In addition, the route includes rock sections. Technical mixed terrain, rock covered with snow, ice in cracks, outcrops. French grading puts the difficulty up to the third category, which on the scale of high-altitude mountaineering means confident command of technique. Passing these rocks in crampons at more than 4,000 meters after a night in a hut is an exercise in itself. To climb here you need not just basic mountaineering, you need serious mountain experience, multi-year, regular. Chamonix guides say it straight. This route is not for your first season, not for your second. This is a summit you come to after many others. This is exactly the line Pierre and Elia choose in July 2025. This is exactly the line Pierre and Elia choose in July 2025. It is not an impulse, not an idea that came up the day before. It is a conscious choice, prepared in advance. For an alpinist with a 30-year track record, the Aiguille de Bionnassay is a logical step on a long list of objectives. For his 24-year-old daughter, who grew up on the rope and has already done 5 to 7 seasons on serious routes in the Alps, it is logical too. Preparing for such an ascent is not a matter of a single day. You have to check the gear, crampons, ice axe, helmet, harness, ropes, protection. You have to deal with the weather. In the Mont Blanc Massif, the window of favorable conditions in July can be narrow and can shift with the forecast hour by hour. You have to agree on the descent plan and on backup options. The classic format of the Aiguille de Bionnassay is 2 days. Day 1, the approach, and a night in a high-altitude hut. Day 2, an early start well before dawn, the ridge itself, exit onto the Dôme de Goutet, or return along the same route. Day 2 carries the main technical load. You start in the dark with headlamps on a frozen surface. At this time, the snow is firmer. The risk of avalanche and rockfall is lower. In the family, Pierre and Elia are known precisely as a responsible rope team. No public words before setting out are quoted in open sources. No loud plans, no social media posts, no interviews. Only internal family conversations, which now stay with their loved ones. There are no detailed data on exactly where they spend the night before the climb. One thing is known, by the morning of the key day, they were supposed to be on the ridge. This is the moment where a technical route stops being training and becomes a real test. That is where they go on the 18th of July, 2025. That is where they go on the 18th of July, 2025. The climb starts from the Saint-Gervais side, the town at the southwestern foot of the Massif. This is the classic area of approach to the Aiguille de Bionnassay. Paths, old service roads, the climb up to the higher huts, a glacier. The same path that guides and climbers heading for the ridge have been using for decades. Pierre and Elia set out at the usual high alpine pace. Packs are tight but not overloaded. Technical clothing, food, protection, gear, gas. At altitude, every extra gram weighs triple, a rule well known to everyone who goes to the mountains. Father and daughter know it too. The 18th of July is a Friday, midsummer season, the start of the weekend. There are many people in the Massif, on the Gouter, on the Trois Monts, in the huts. But alternative routes are less crowded. Bionnassay is usually not busy, precisely because of the difficulty. Encounters with other rope teams are rare. That is both the charm of the route and its danger. If something goes wrong, there will be no random witnesses nearby. The last contact with the family is logged during the day. While there is still signal, within the usual rhythm, relatives would later say that the messages were standard: status, plans, nothing alarming. In the Alps, this happens all the time. A rope team heads out in the morning, stays in touch up to a certain point, then goes into a zone where there is no signal, or almost none. Everyone who waits at home knows this pattern. On the evening of the 18th of July, the contact stops. This is not yet a reason to panic. High mountains always take away the signal, and that is normal. But by the logic of the route, by this point, Pierre and Elia should already have been in the key technical zone. On that very ridge where you can't afford a mistake. On that very ridge where you can't afford a mistake, contact is lost. At home, in Étival-Clairefontaine, the family is waiting for the evening signal. Experienced rope teams have a habit: a short message, a check-in, a call when the connection allows. This is not just a formality. This is a way of telling your loved ones that everything is going according to plan. On the evening of the 18th of July, this signal doesn't come. An hour goes by, 2, 3. In the high mountains, a gap of several hours is explainable. The device may have died, the network may drop out on an entire stretch of ridge. A person may simply not have had time. No one hits the panic button in the first hours. Everyone close to alpinists knows that worrying too early means tormenting yourself for no reason. But more time passes than usually goes by before contact. The family waits to the limit, and then does the only right thing. Passes the information to the rescue services of Haute-Savoie, the Chamonix PGHM, the same specialized unit that works with the Massif year-round. The operators take down the data: who went out, where, by which route, when the last contact was. The countdown begins that alpinists simply call the night. At altitude, it's almost impossible to work at night. It's dark, cold, there's no visibility. Any mistake by rescuers can cost them their own lives. A full-scale search operation begins only at first light. Until morning, the family stays alone with a phone that no one answers. That night is the longest. The relatives know there's an experienced rope team on Bionnassay. They know Pierre doesn't do stupid things. They know Elia is disciplined, but they also know the statistics of the Mont Blanc Massif, and they understand that every missed hour works against those who are up there. Hope holds until an answer comes, and the answer comes in the morning, and the answer comes in the morning. On the 19th of July, 2025, with the first rays of the sun on the ridges of Mont Blanc, Chamonix, PGHM rescuers launch a search operation in the Aiguille de Bionnassay zone. A helicopter is deployed, the main tool in a massif where distances are measured not in kilometers but in differences in altitude. In parallel, ground teams with alpine training are working. The searchers do what they always do in such situations. First, they scan the ridge, the line of the route, where the rope team was supposed to be. Then they look at the lower benches, the couloirs, the zones of possible fall. The helicopter passes along the wall, carefully scanning the glacier and the rocky ledges below. Pierre and Elia are found relatively quickly, at the foot of the needle, in a place where the route doesn't pass, in a zone you only reach after coming off the ridge. The distance from the presumed line of the fall to the point where they are found tells the rescuers a lot, even before the official conclusion. The nature of the terrain in this part of the Massif is such that in circumstances like these there is practically no chance left. The operation changes status. From a search, it turns into an evacuation. The task now is to bring the two safely down to the Chamonix Valley. For the rescuers, this is hard work. Not physically, they're used to it, but emotionally. Father and daughter, a rope team from the same family. People who have loved ones at home, loved ones who are still waiting. The news is passed on to Haute-Savoie, and further to the Vosges. Normally, they try not to boil such messages down to dry formulas. But the meaning is one: two are not coming back. On the same day, the news of the death of two climbers on the Aiguille de Bionnassay reaches the French media. The second circle of the story begins, the public one. The second circle of the story begins, the public one. And it always requires a short formulation. The Chamonix PGHM releases an official version of what happened, restrained and technically precise, without speculation. Two alpinists, father and daughter, probably slipped and fell from the ridge of the Aiguille de Bionnassay. The key word here is probably. No one saw the fall. There are no witnesses who can describe the moment. There are no recordings. There are only tracks on the route, the position of the bodies at the foot, and knowledge of the terrain. On that basis, the rescuers reach a conclusion that fits the Massif's standard picture: a fall on a narrow snow and rock ridge. The gendarmerie describes the route in plain words. Rather technical, demands significant experience. This is not a journalist's assessment, but the phrasing of people who know the route not from photographs. They remind that on ridges like this, the mistake of one person in the rope team rarely stays the mistake of only one. This is a feature of the terrain and of working together on a rope. There is a chance to hold a fall, but it is small. The prosecutor's office of Haute-Savoie opens a preliminary investigation, not because there are suspicions of anyone's fault, but because under French law, any death in the mountains is recorded legally. Experts will examine the gear. Terrain specialists will assess the point of the fall. Meteorologists will reconstruct the conditions of that day. In open sources, there is so far neither the exact section of the ridge where the fall occurred, nor a clear cause. It could have been a melting crust. It could have been an unexpectedly fragile rock hold. It could have been simple fatigue at the moment when the brain, at altitude, starts to let you down. On Mont Blanc, such stories rarely have a single culprit. Usually several factors stack up, and the outcome is always the same. The outcome is always the same, and this outcome reaches the Vosges on the same day the bodies are brought down from the mountain. The news of the deaths of Pierre and Elia Poirot arrives in Étival-Clairefontaine. In a town of barely 2,000 residents, any such news is not a line in a bulletin. These are people everyone here knows by face. A father you'd meet by the bakery. A daughter who came home on vacation from medical school. The Lycée Beaumont loses a teacher of 30 years standing. Entire graduating classes went through his room. The students who remember him are now grown adults across France. Math is not a subject that is forgotten along with the teacher. For many, his voice, his manner of explaining, his patience will stay in their memory all their lives. Colleagues lose not only a teacher, but also one of the most stable people in the staff room. The Vosges Mountaineering Club is left without its president, without the man who for decades kept the club running, organized outings, taught beginners, kept the records, maintained ties with guides and other clubs in the region. Such figures aren't replaced with one signature on an order. Their place stays empty for a long time. The school parcours de santé, the fitness trail that Pierre built for the pupils of Saint-Dié, remains as his signature. Marked routes, wooden structures, markings on trees. In a way, it is now a memorial. Everyone who walks this trail walks through a project that he left behind. Elia's future profession, doctor, remains unrealized. At the medical university among her classmates, she will be remembered as young, focused, serious. France loses a person who, in a couple of years, was supposed to step into a clinic. In a couple of years, she was supposed to step into a clinic. And in the Mont Blanc Massif on the 19th of July, 2025, another item is recorded in the long summer statistics. For the Chamonix PGHM, it's a working shift, a helicopter flight, a ground team, an evacuation, a report. For journalists and regional outlets, a short piece of news of a few paragraphs. For tourists in Chamonix that day, probably a background that changes nothing. They go to their cable cars, drink coffee, look at the summits with cameras. But for the Vosges, everything is different. In Étival-Clairefontaine, in Saint-Dié, at the school, in the club, conversations are happening that will go on for a long time. About how even experience does not guarantee a return. About how the Aiguille de Bionnassay is a route that demands absolute form at that exact hour and minute. About how the mountains don't distinguish between good and bad people, between teachers and students, between beginners and veterans. The story of Pierre and Elia quickly becomes part of the big conversation about technical mountaineering and its risks. It is not unique in the sense that such tragedies happen in the Massif regularly, but it is special in another way: father and daughter. A rope team that had been built for more than 20 years. A family line that goes off a single ridge all at once. The Poirot family stays away from publicity. There are no interviews, there are no loud words. That is their right and their style, which it seems matches the style of Pierre himself. Calm, restrained, without unnecessary gestures. The mountain remains, the route remains, the one others will continue to climb. And a rope team the length of a life remains, one that left together. On one rope, in 1 second, on one morning above Chamonix. They are found 100 meters below the summit of Mont Blanc, on the ice wall called Mur de la Côte, 41 and 53, Italians, a doctor, and an engineer. 6 days earlier, they had been smiling into the camera at the top of the Matterhorn. Her great dream had come true. Now they are lying in the snow in each other's arms, and 70 hours ago, one of them managed to shout into the phone, "We can't see anything! Come and get us! We're going to freeze!" The line went dead. The storm held the mountain for 2 full days. This is the story of a climbing pair that Mont Blanc did not let go home, and of an embrace found just below the summit. Mont Blanc stands on the border between France and Italy, and its summit, at 4,808 meters, is the highest point in all of Western Europe. For an outsider, that figure sounds like something far away and exotic. But for millions of Europeans, it's the opposite. The mountain sits right on their doorstep. From Milan to the Chamonix Valley is less than 4 hours by highway. From Geneva, about 2. On a clear day, Mont Blanc is visible from Turin, from Lyon, from Bern, a white pyramid on the horizon. It is precisely this closeness that makes it one of the deadliest mountains in the world by number of victims per year. People come here for the weekend. People who, in their ordinary lives, go to the office climb these slopes. The classic route, the so-called Gutter route, is usually described as straightforward. Technically, there are no vertical walls, no hard pitches. The second popular option is the Trois Monts route. It starts from the Aiguille du Midi cable car and goes over 3 summits in a row, Mont Blanc du Tacoul, Mont Maudit, and finally, Mont Blanc itself. In photographs, both routes look like smooth white slopes. In reality, up there you are in true high-altitude territory. Thin air, sub-zero temperatures even in summer, winds that can shift in half an hour, and glaciers hiding crevasses tens of meters deep. Every summer, Mont Blanc takes in hundreds of climbing pairs, and every summer the mountain refuses to let some of them go back down. In September of 2024, the count will rise to 4 lives in a single weekend. Among the dead are 2 Italians, Andrea Galimberti and Sara Stefanelli, a pair from Lombardy. They will be found lying next to each other on the same ice wall, roughly 100 meters below the summit, found in an embrace. That detail will later travel around the world's news agencies and turn their story into a symbol of the entire autumn of 2024 on Mont Blanc. But first, we need to understand who they were and how they ended up alone together on that slope. Start with the one who was leading the pair. Andrea Galimberti was born in 1971. And at 53 he had most of his adult life in the mountains behind him. He lived in the village of Cabbiate, in the province of Como, in that part of Lombardy where the Alps are no longer a horizon, but the backdrop to every morning. By training, he was an engineer, a graduate of the Politecnico di Milano, one of the strongest technical universities in Italy. By profession, he was an entrepreneur, a man used to calculations, schedules, and plans. He carried that same methodical streak into the mountains. In his free time, Andrea was a marathoner and a skyrunner. He ran long distances over rough terrain and trained year-round. He had more than 62 Alpine 4000ers to his name. That's a huge number. In the entire Alps, there are only a little over 80 such peaks, and ticking them off is a task that takes many climbers a lifetime. He had climbed the Matterhorn several times. He knew its walls and ridges as familiar routes rather than as challenges. Mont Blanc wasn't a beginner's story for Andrea either. He knew the normal routes, understood the logistics of the refuges, read the forecasts. A few years earlier, he had founded the Green Rock Alpine Club, a small community where he gathered friends and kindred spirits. The club had its own weekend trips, its joint expeditions, its own culture. On social media, Andrea kept what amounted to a climbing diary. After every serious ascent, a short post would appear. Route, time, partners, a few photographs. Those who knew him personally described him as calm, cautious, and very disciplined. He didn't like to gamble. He believed in preparation and in working with the forecast. For people like him, Mont Blanc was a familiar mountain, but not an ordinary one. It was one of those peaks you treat with respect, because you know how fast things can change up there. In September of 2024, Andrea was going back to this mountain not with a clubmate, and not with an experienced skyrunner. He was going there as a pair with Sara Stefanelli, a woman who had discovered climbing just 3 months earlier. Sara Stefanelli was Andrea's complete opposite in climbing experience, though in life they were close. She was 41. She came from Genoa, from that Liguria where the mountains are low, and the main landscape is the sea and the quarters of an old port city. Then came the move to Lombardy, study and work. Sara was a doctor by profession. She worked in clinics in the Milan area, in the hospitals of Garbagnate, Milanese, and Rho. Those are large medical centers with dense shifts, heavy on-call rotations, and patients with serious diagnoses. Colleagues remembered her as one of those doctors who stay late after a shift, who personally call families back, who remember names. Serious sport and the mountains came late into her life. She really took up climbing only in the summer of 2024. She completed her basic course just 3 months before the Mont Blanc ascent. The course means a few trips with instructors, skills in handling a rope, crampons, an ice axe, basic self-arrest techniques, and the basics of moving on a rope together. For some people, such a course stays an episode, leaving only a couple of photographs behind. For Sara, it became a turning point. Within a couple of weeks, she began training on her own, running, going into the mountains for long distances, trying easy routes. Friends noticed how she was literally transforming over a month. Colleagues remembered her in the final weeks as radiant. In the doctor's lounge, she talked about mountains more than about work. She told Andrea about her dream: to climb the Matterhorn. Not to become a professional climber, not to tick off all the classic alpine lines. Just the Matterhorn, one specific mountain, that iconic peak every Italian sees on postcards. A pair made up of an experienced mentor and an enthusiastic student is not a rare configuration in the mountains. It often works, and it often produces beautiful stories, but it also demands double responsibility from the senior partner for 2 people. For Andrea, that autumn was exactly this kind of pair. He was going up Mont Blanc as the lead. Sara was going second, with months of experience against his decades. The 2 were going up Mont Blanc not as guide and client. Andrea and Sara were partners not only on the rope, but in life. They had a close relationship, a shared home, shared plans for the future, and that is what makes their story so recognizable. Into the mountains as a pair, you often don't find paid expedition clients, but couples for whom the mountain becomes part of a shared language. In the morning, some go out for a run together. Others pick up a backpack and drive toward a pass. For Andrea and Sara, the summer of 2024 was a continuous string of such trips. Andrea's social media kept a chain of posts: outings on easier 4,000ers, training on rock, short progress reports. In one of those texts, he described the beginning of their shared life in the mountains. In his words, it started like this. Sara had finished a classic mountaineering course 3 months earlier, and after that, she began going out with him. And one day, when they were discussing plans, she said, "Andre, I've always had a dream, to climb the Matterhorn." That line, in Andrea's telling, is enough to understand their dynamic. In the mountains, he was the lead in the relationship. She was the one who set the targets and pulled the pair along by her drive. Their whole summer program was built around one big mountain and peaking in form for it. Acclimatization outings on smaller summits, gear checks, practicing rope work on ice sections, altitude work on easier 4,000ers. They did all of this fast, one outing after another, without breaks. For Andrea, that rhythm was natural. He had been training his whole life. For Sara, it was a crash course squeezed into a few weeks between hospital shifts and her vacation. By the end of August, the couple arrived at the main goal of the season in good physical shape and with a clear plan. They had a specific mountain, a specific route, and a specific date. Under that logic, the next step was the Matterhorn. It was scheduled for the first days of September, and they had no intention of slipping the plan. For an Italian, the Matterhorn is not just a mountain, it's an icon, a geometric pyramid on the Swiss-Italian border, 4,478 meters high, one of the most recognizable summits on the planet. From the Italian side, the route goes up from the Carroll Refuge along the classic ridge. It demands serious physical shape, experience on mixed rock and ice terrain, the ability to move fast, because in bad weather, there is nowhere to sit it out on those ridges. Andrea had climbed the Matterhorn several times in his life. For Sara, it was the first and, as it later turned out, the only time. In early September of 2024, the couple set out on the route and reached the summit safely. It was the summit of her dream. They took photographs, rested briefly, and went back down the ridge the same way they had come up. After the descent, Andrea posted on his social media, the two of them in the shot, the sharp profile of the Matterhorn behind them, the caption short and warm. The Italian mountain community responded lively. A small but noticeable storyline of the season, an experienced Lombard and his 40-year-old partner, who had only just discovered the mountains, standing together on the main icon of the Alps. Only 6 days passed between that ascent and the start of Mont Blanc. That is a very short interval. The Matterhorn, in terms of strain, is a big mountain, and the body needs time to recover after it. Experienced climbers after such ascents take at least a week or two off, so muscles can return to baseline, sleep can normalize, altitude load can ease off. Andrea and Sara essentially had no such pause. Straight after the Matterhorn, they were already planning the next target. The logic is clear from inside the couple. Form was at its peak. The weather in early September still allowed them to climb, and both of them had the time. Delay, and the season could slip away. On top of that, after the Matterhorn, there was a sense that the main thing had been achieved, and Mont Blanc was technically easier. That sense would work against them. Because at close to 5,000 meters, the technical simplicity of a route means very little against a storm. By the evening of Friday, September 6th of 2024, Andrea and Sara arrived in Chamonix. This little town at the foot of Mont Blanc works in summer as a real climbing capital. The main street is packed with sports shops, guide agencies, cafes with a view of the glaciers. In places like this, for every group in a restaurant, there are 3 on the slope above, and you can feel it even in the air. The couple went through all the steps that dozens of other pairs take on the same day. They picked up the latest forecast. They rode the famous Aiguille du Midi cable car up to the top station at 3,842 meters. From there, a short traverse along a narrow snow ridge to the plateau. Then across the plateau to Refuge de Cosmique, a stone building at 3,613 meters. That refuge is the classic starting point for the Trois Monts route. Inside, it's tight. Bunk beds on multiple levels, a shared dining hall, a simple but warm dinner. Every conversation is about the same thing: tomorrow's weather and start time. The forecast was mixed. The Chamonix guide services pointed to a short window in the first half of Saturday and a noticeable deterioration by evening. That meant whoever left early and moved fast had a chance to get up and down before the storm. Whoever was even a few hours late risked meeting bad weather at altitude. Many groups made the same decision that night, to start in the dark, right after midnight, or a little later. Andrea and Sara chose the same option. They went to bed early. Gear was laid out the evening before: rope, crampons, ice axes, warm layers. Breakfast was going to be in the dark by the light of headlamps. Outside the refuge were occasional wind gusts, stars above the glacier, that particular quiet that comes before a serious climb. Neither they nor their neighbors on the bunks yet knew that these were the last calm hours of their lives, that the storm, which the forecast had pinned to Saturday evening, would hit the slope earlier and hit harder, and that this was the last time the couple was walking out of that refuge. At around 2 in the morning on Saturday, September 7th, the pair left Cosmique. Outside it was dark and frosty, the sky still clear. Above the refuge, thin beams of headlamps crawled up the snow slope. Several groups were heading out on the route at the same time. Trois Monts is a route that, on a map, looks more like a traverse than a simple climb. It goes over 3 summits in a row. First, Mont Blanc du Tacoul, a small peak by Mont Blanc standards, around 4,248 meters. Then, Mont Maudit, 4,465 meters, the technically toughest part of the route, with a steep ice section near the col. And finally, Mont Blanc itself, reached along a gentle upper ridge. A night departure is the standard strategy. Ice at that altitude is harder at night. Snow bridges over crevasses are more reliable. The risk of serac collapse and avalanches is lower. On the first section, on Takul, Andrea and Sara moved at a working pace. The crampon tracks of the groups ahead were laid into firm snow. The wind was tolerable. Visibility was normal. On the shoulder of Takul, it was already obvious that altitude was making itself felt. Breathing accelerates, steps shorten. That isn't an alarm signal. Everyone climbs like that. Beyond that, the route drops into a small col and then climbs again up Mont Maudit. Here the slope is steeper, the sections are icy, and rope work demands more attention. On Maudit, Andrea and Sara noticed that their pace was dropping. The reasons are well known and usually mundane. Accumulated fatigue from the last weeks, too little rest after the Matterhorn, insufficient acclimatization, specifically at this altitude, even if overall fitness was good. Some of the groups on the route turned around at that point. The forecast for the second half of the day didn't look good, and the slow movers had the smallest chance of getting down before the storm. Andrea and Sara made a different choice. They kept climbing. From Maudit they moved toward the upper plateau, where the dome of Mont Blanc was already visible. Their watches showed that they were noticeably behind schedule, but there seemed to be only a little left to go. Just a moment ago, it felt like only a little was left. In practice, those last few hundred meters of elevation would stretch out over hours. At around 1 in the afternoon, Andrea and Sara were standing on the summit of Mont Blanc, 4,808 meters, the highest point in Western Europe under their feet. In terms of climbing time, it had been roughly 11 hours since they left the refuge. For a classic Trois Monts, that's a long time. The average pace on this route is 4 to 6 hours to the summit. 11 means only one thing. The pair had been moving slowly, tiring, stopping often. The summit brought a brief psychological lift. For Sara, it was another big dream, fulfilled after the Matterhorn. For Andrea, it was a familiar spot he had stood on before. But even in the photos taken by other climbers nearby, you can see that the weather was no longer what it had been at the start of the route. From the south, from the Italian side, heavy clouds were moving in. The wind on the dome was picking up. The line of the horizon was losing sharpness. Anyone standing on Mont Blanc at that moment understood. The window was closing. Ahead was the descent. And each hour now cost more than on the way up. Andrea made an important decision. They would go down a different way from the one they had come up. Going back through Maudit and Takul, with its hard ice section on tired muscles, was a bad idea, especially if the weather worsened. The alternative was to descend by the other classic route, by way of the Gutter. That option leads into a different valley. Logistically, it's the other side of the Massif, but in terms of terrain, it's longer and gentler. And crucially, it passes through a section known to the whole climbing world, a section called Mur de la Côte. The decision was logical. On paper, the Gutter route was safer after a long day. In practice, it meant the pair was heading into the part of the slope where most climbing pairs who get into trouble on Mont Blanc run into the bad weather. What they didn't know yet was that their window for making decisions had essentially closed. The countdown to the storm was no longer being measured in hours. It had shifted to minutes. The minutes ran out faster than they could descend. Mur de la Côte is a famous ice slope on the normal Mont Blanc route. At an altitude of around 4,500 meters, the slope is steep, exposed, without natural shelter. On one side, a wall drops away. On the other is an ice field. In clear weather, there's a trodden path along it, marked by the crampon tracks of dozens of groups. In poor visibility, Mur de la Côte becomes one of the most vulnerable sections of the whole Massif. Every year there are falls and avalanches here, and it is here that people the mountain refuse to let go are most often found. As Andrea and Sara approached this section, the weather didn't change gradually. It flipped in a jerk. The front hit the slope in just a few minutes. The temperature on the summit and on the upper slopes of Mont Blanc dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. The wind, which an hour earlier had been running at an uncomfortable but bearable strength, accelerated to 150 kilometers per hour. For a pair on an exposed ice slope, those are catastrophic numbers. Wind like that doesn't just knock you over. It won't let you stand upright without leaning on an ice axe. Visibility collapsed to zero. Snow came down as a dense wall and raced horizontally. The crampon tracks of the groups ahead disappeared under a fresh layer in 5 minutes. The trail, which could have been walked down from memory, ceased to exist. According to Italian outlets, one more disaster struck the pair on that section. At some point, they fell into a crevasse. That's typical for Mur de la Côte in bad visibility. You can't tell a snow bridge from solid ground. They got themselves out. But after the crevasse, everything on them was wet, some of the warm layers soaked through, and time was being burned at a catastrophic rate. Moving by memory on Mur de la Côte was no longer possible. The route map existed only in theory. In reality, there was a wall of wind, snow, and icy cold around them, and the route had vanished beneath their feet. At this minute, Andrea made his last active decision of the day, to pull out the phone. He pulled out the phone. At roughly 4,500 meters on Mur de la Côte, in a wind of 150 kilometers per hour, in extreme cold, Andrea dialed the rescuer's number. The call came through to the Chamonix Gendarmerie, to the PGHM unit, Peloton de Gendarmerie de Haute Montagne, the mountain unit responsible for rescue operations across the whole massif. On duty were experienced officers who hear such calls dozens of times a season. The conversation was short. On the other end of the line, they heard a sentence in Italian. Non vediamo nulla, veniteci a prendere, rischiamo di morire congelati. We can't see anything, come and get us, we're going to freeze to death. The duty officer managed to log coordinates from the phone signal. Altitude, 4,500 meters, the northern side of the Mont Blanc Massif, the Mur de la Côte area. That was the point he wrote into the log as the last known position of the pair. A few seconds later, the line dropped. The duty officer tried to call back. Nothing. Tried again a minute later. No result. A senior PGHM officer would later make a very dry remark that would end up in every news brief. We were only able to briefly get in touch with the Italians and learn their point at around 4,600 meters on the northern slope of Mont Blanc, but the connection was lost. Behind those procedural words were two living people, standing on an ice slope in a blizzard, in wet gear, in extreme cold. Neither they nor the rescuers knew the main thing at that moment. This was the last time Andrea and Sara would speak with anyone from the outside world. From that point on, only the waiting began. The PGHM command put the helicopter crews on alert. It became clear instantly that no one could be lifted onto the route. The wind in the valley was still bearable, but in the summit zone, there was a wall in which a machine couldn't hold course. The rescuers sat at the ready, staring at the radar screen and at a forecast that had the storm painted in for at least another 2 days. The forecast came true. From Saturday evening onward, a real storm settled over Mont Blanc, and it didn't release the massif either on Sunday or on Monday. Above the upper part of the mountain, a dense storm stood for the entire time. The wind above 4,000 meters did not drop below 100 kilometers per hour. Visibility was 0, and the temperature in the summit zone held at -10 and below. According to observations and PGHM reports, roughly 50 centimeters of fresh snow fell on the slopes during that time. That snow changed the mountain. It closed crevasses, turning the glacier into a deceptively smooth field. It erased the last tracks of groups that had passed before the storm. It buried gear if anyone dropped it, and it buried people if they stayed out on the exposed slope. Lower down, in Chamonix, the standard work of the Mountain Rescue Command was underway. The helicopter crews, Dragon 74 from Annecy and Chouca from Chamonix, were on standby. But any attempt to take a machine above 4,000 meters in such conditions meant risking both crew and aircraft. The pilots did not go up. The ground teams couldn't move higher than the refuge either. The slopes were overloaded with fresh snow, and the avalanche danger on the route was at its peak. The ones who held on to hope longest were the families. In Cabbiate, at Andrea's house, they tried to reach him over and over. The phone was silent. In Liguria and in Lombardy, in the families and circle of Sara, the same process. On Sunday morning, it became clear. The couple had not come back off the mountain. The Italian media picked up the story. The first headlines about 2 missing climbers on Mont Blanc appeared on news sites. Photos of the smiling pair from the Matterhorn spread through the news. The hours passed. People who knew altitude understood the simple truth. Without shelter in such conditions, there's very little chance left. Officially, their fate was not yet being commented on. But at the PGHM command and in the Chamonix guide community, it was effectively understood that they weren't looking for the living anymore. 2 days went by like that, then another. On Tuesday, September 10th, by morning, A window appeared in the forecast for the first time. The wind at altitude dropped. The clouds over the massif broke up, and for the first time in many hours, the white dome of Mont Blanc was visible in full from the Chamonix Valley. The PGHM command ordered a flight. Both rescue machines lifted off from different airfields. Dragon 74 from Annecy, the bright yellow Sécurité Civile helicopter, and Choucaix from Chamonix, the mountain gendarmerie aircraft. Both headed along the northern slope of Mont Blanc, toward where the last signal had been registered on Saturday. The flight was short but intense. The pilots worked the machines along Mur de la Côte, and the crew studied the slope from above. In operations like these, every movement of snow counts, every shadow that shouldn't be a shadow. At around 4,500 meters, first one crew and then the second spotted two motionless figures in the snow. They were lying close to each other, partly buried under a fresh layer. It was Andrea and Sara. Between their last phone call and this moment, about 70 hours had passed. Almost 3 full days. The rescuers worked fast and cleanly. The machine hovered over the slope. A specialist descended on the cable. Every minute at that altitude in the mountains means the risk of the weather closing in again. The coordinates of the point were logged, the bodies were recovered and flown down to the valley, to the DZ de Bois landing zone in lower Chamonix. At the same spot, they also delivered the bodies of 2 more climbers, whom the helicopters had found roughly 100 meters from Andrea and Sara. Those were members of a different group, which we'll come to shortly. At the DZ des Bois in Chamonix, gendarmerie vehicles were waiting, along with representatives of the Haute-Savoie prefecture, staff from the Italian consulate, and fellow guides. At some point, a short message went out over the local radio frequencies. 4 dead had been found on Mont Blanc. Within an hour, that sentence would be in the news of the French, then the Italian, and by evening, the world's agencies. When the rescuers moved in close to the 2 figures on Mur de la Côte, a detail became visible that every report would later repeat. Andrea and Sara were found in an embrace. They were lying pressed against each other on the ice slope, in snow that covered them up to the shoulders. That posture was not accidental. The French authorities and PGHM representatives would later say it carefully but unambiguously. The pair had most likely huddled against each other to preserve warmth. At -15 and winds of 150 kilometers per hour without shelter, that is an instinctive attempt to buy a little more time. The official cause of death was hypothermia against a backdrop of physical exhaustion. The Haute-Savoie prefecture in a short statement used the phrase died of exhaustion. Medical examination later clarified that death most likely occurred on Saturday itself, at the height of the storm, soon after the last phone call. That means the pair did not spend all 3 days of the search waiting for rescue. That information became public already on Tuesday evening. The Italian papers Il Giorno, L'Ego, Unione Sarda, and Fan Page ran the same detail on their front pages. Found in an embrace. International agencies picked it up without translating. In English, found in an embrace. In French, retrouvés enlacés. CBS, France 24, Sky News, and The Guardian ran reports from the mountain through the next 24 hours. The photos of the pair on the summit of the Matterhorn, the very ones Andrea had posted 6 days earlier, became the second most frequent image in news blocks after shots of helicopters above the massif. That detail, the embrace in the snow just below the summit, turned the story of Andrea and Sara into a symbol not only of the tragedy of a single pair, but of that entire autumn on Mont Blanc. 3 days, 4 dead, a weekend in which the mountain reminded everyone how dangerous it still is, despite its popularity and its closeness to large cities. Next to Andrea and Sara, about 100 meters from their point, 2 more dead climbers were found that same weekend. They weren't random people on a neighboring slope. They were members of another group that on the same Saturday, September 7th, had set out for Mont Blanc. The group was a club ascent from South Korea. Adult men and women of different ages on the mountain for the same dream, to stand on the highest point in Western Europe. Club trips of that kind are a familiar form of climbing tourism from Korea to the Alps. The logistics had been planned for them, the refugees booked, the route laid out. The same storm that caught the Italian pair caught the Korean group in roughly the same zone. Altitude 4,500 meters, the northern side of the massif, the Mur de la Côte area, In the same place where Andrea and Sara lost their bearings, so did they. Part of the group managed to regroup and start descending earlier, using the landmarks that were still visible. Another part stayed higher, at the worst point on the slope. Two people from the Korean group, a middle-aged man and woman, did not survive the storm. They stayed on the slope. PGHM helicopters found their bodies on Tuesday, September 10th, on the same flight that discovered Andrea and Sara. The distance between the 2 points was about 100 meters. For the crew, it was a single operation, but the group's fate was not entirely tragic. 2 more of its members had been lifted alive earlier from another point on the massif. Those who had managed to get out of the storm zone during the short window received help in time. The tally of the weekend of September 7th to 10th for Mont Blanc: 4 dead, 2 Italians and 2 Koreans, and 2 people saved at the last moment. For France, it was one of the costliest stories on the massif in several seasons. For Italy and Korea, it was an international tragedy that, in the days after the bodies were found, became one of the top climbing news stories of the autumn. After the evacuation from the mountain, the bodies of Andrea and Sara were taken to the morgue in the Chamonix Valley and then handed over through procedure to the Italian authorities. The farewell took place in Cabbiate, in Como, and in Genoa, where Sara's relatives arrived. Hundreds came to the ceremonies: family, friends, colleagues, climbers from neighboring clubs, acquaintances from running, patients from the hospitals. The Green Rock Alpine Club, the community Andrea had founded many years earlier, published a short statement. Without extra words, it spoke of the loss of 2 members of the club, of the fact that the mountains had taken them on the same day, on the same wall. At the hospitals in Garbagnate and Rho, where Sara had worked, people remembered a doctor who had recently found her great passion outside of medicine. Patients and colleagues told short stories: how she had shown photos of the Matterhorn in the doctor's room, how she had planned her next trips, how she had been getting ready for her vacation. The Italian and French press analyzed the tragedy in detail. They discussed the Trois Monts route and the descent by the Gouter. They discussed the forecast and the decision to head up on Saturday. They discussed the pace of the climb, 11 hours instead of the usual 6, and the question of whether they should have turned around earlier before the summit. That's a normal after-action analysis in the Alps, the kind that follows every similar case. It isn't a direct accusation, but there's a shared agenda in it: what to do about the accessibility of Mont Blanc. The mountain stands next to large cities. You can get here by car in a few hours. That draws people of every level of preparation. The Haute-Savoie prefecture once again reminded everyone: the normal route on Mont Blanc remains a serious high-altitude climb, not a Sunday walk. At the start of the next week, snow fell over the massif again. It covered the last traces of the rescuers' work on Mur de la Côte. The embrace of Andrea and Sara, found 100 meters below the summit, disappeared under a fresh layer. The mountain returned to its usual rhythm, where after every storm a new window arrives, and someone once again leaves the Cosmique's refuge heading for the summit, hoping to make it in time. 5:25 in the morning, the 12th of July, 2012. On the northern slope of Mont Maudit, the mountain whose name means the cursed one, 28 climbers are moving at the same time. Among them is Roger Payne, a certified mountain guide, former General Secretary of the British Mountaineering Council, one of the finest avalanche safety instructors in Europe. Within 60 seconds, 9 of those 28 will not come back from the route. Payne will be one of them. Why does an avalanche instructor die in an avalanche on a route he has walked more than 100 times? And why will 2 of his clients in the same avalanche turn out to be men who were raising money for a hospice? Roger Payne was born on the 16th of July, 1956, in London. A couple of years later, the family settled in Hammersmith, a working-class, noisy district on the western side of the city, where pub doors slam in the evenings and the buses shriek down Fulham Palace Road in the morning. The mountains from here feel about as far away as another planet. The nearest Sirius peak is 700 kilometers away, in a straight line, in Scotland, and in Hammersmith, the highest point is the chimney of the gasworks. He comes to the mountains by accident. A Boy Scout troop operated in the district, and he joined it as a schoolboy. The troop would take teenagers on short hiking trips across the English hills, later across the Welsh and Scottish uplands. For most boys, it was an amusement for a couple of years. For Payne, it turned out to be the foundation. He quickly realized that he wanted to spend time in places without houses, cars, or classrooms. Still at school, he was already traveling north on his own, to the Cairngorms, to Ben Nevis, to the winter ridges of Scotland. There he saw real ice and wind for the first time. Then he discovered the crags of Snowdonia and the English Lake District. He trained almost every weekend, knew the stones by heart, and filled his diary with long lists of routes. He enrolled at Sunderland Polytechnic on the teacher training course. His studies ran in parallel with his climbing. He became president of the Institute's climbing club, organized trips, and coached first-year students. In 1983, he qualified as a teacher and went to teach in the northeast of England. That same year, he passed the exam for Certified Mountain Guide, joining the British elite, which at that time included fewer than 100 people. And since 1977, he had been going to the Alps every summer, 6 seasons in a row, and by the time of his diploma, he moved across glaciers more confidently than across the streets of Hammersmith. By the early 80s, the Alps were more familiar to him than the streets of London. And in 1982, his accumulated experience took him far across the ocean. Payne flew to Alaska, to Denali, the highest point in North America, 6,190 meters. He climbed it first by the standard West Buttress, and then came back for the far tougher Cassin Ridge. For a 26-year-old graduate, this was a serious test of endurance. The route demands weeks at altitude and only tolerates those who can withstand cold and oxygen deprivation. Payne came back from Alaska a changed man. He now knew he was capable of something big. He kept teaching, but spent more and more of his time in the mountains. He worked as an instructor, led groups through the Alps every summer, and in winter went off to Scotland to teach the young how to climb ice. His expedition career picked up speed on its own. No season was like the last. Each trip was longer and higher. In 1986, he went to Peru, to the Cordillera Blanca, a belt of 6,000-meter peaks in the north of the country, where glaciers begin right above tropical villages. There, on an international expedition, he met Julianne Klima. She was from New Zealand, also a certified guide, with her own impressive list of summits. They clicked instantly, both as climbers and as people. Together they chose a hard objective, a first ascent of a direct line up the south face of Nevada Rurek. It was a technical wall that no one had attempted before them. They climbed it in alpine style, no prior fixing, no extra people, no porters. The route received a grade of ED+, one of the highest on the international scale. For both of them, this became a point of departure. From here began their life together, professional, personal, expeditionary. Ahead lay 26 years of shared walls, one shared flat in Switzerland, and dozens of places where only their 2 names would be recorded in the first ascent registers. Ahead lay 26 years of shared walls. But first came a decade that Payne spent mostly not in the mountains, but behind a desk. In 1989, the British Mountaineering Council offered him the position of National Officer. BMC is the largest association of climbers in Britain, bringing together clubs, guides, climbing gyms, and hundreds of thousands of members. For an independent climber, this was a rare invitation. He accepted it because he saw a chance to change the rules. In 1995, he was promoted to General Secretary, effectively the Executive Director. BMC at that moment was being shaken up. Financial difficulties, an outdated structure, conflicts between the traditional clubs and the new climbing centers. Payne took the organization in hand and began to rebuild it from the inside. He launched new programs, reallocated budgets, and struck agreements with sponsors. In 1996, he helped found the Mountain Training Trust, an independent body that took over management of the legendary National Training Center at Place Y Brennan. That same year, he launched the magazine Summit, which became the leading publication of British mountaineering for 2 decades. He brought international competitions to Britain, altogether 8 major tournaments, including the 1999 World Championship. BMC membership grew. Its reputation was restored. Internal conflicts were extinguished. Colleagues remember his loud, low voice as he dictated letters to his assistants, and his habit of working right up until the last second before a flight. The story goes that one day a flight was delayed, and he managed to get back from the airport to the office to send out an important memo he had forgotten that morning. That was Payne in a nutshell. Someone who never sat comfortably in a bureaucrat's chair. He turned the role into a tool, and when in 2001 his work at BMC formally came to an end, the organization was already entirely different from what it had been 12 years earlier. But Payne himself, over those same years, changed less than his office did. He did not turn into a pure administrator. Every holiday, every gap between meetings, he used to go off into the big mountains. The higher his post, the more serious the routes he chose. In 1992, he climbed Broad Peak, an 8,000-meter peak of the Karakoram, 8,051 meters high. It was his first 8,000er. A year later, he went higher and more dangerous still. In 1993, Payne set off for K2, the world's second summit, 8,611 meters. K2 is called the Savage Mountain. Roughly 1 in every 4 climbers who reaches its summit does not come back alive. Going with him on the team were Victor Saunders and Alan Hinkies, among the best-known British mountaineers of the time. The expedition was hard. The weather broke several times. Rope teams were forced to retreat. At one of the camps, they came across a seriously injured Swedish climber, and the team abandoned their own plans to help him down. Payne and Klima came back from K2 alive. That was what mattered. During the 90s, K2 would claim dozens of climbers, many from the same generation. The tally of their expeditions over those same years grew faster than that of many professionals. More than 20 trips to the Karakoram and the Himalayas, and almost all of them alongside Julianne. They climbed in Nepal, India, Pakistan, China, Tibet, Kazakhstan, and Alaska. Every expedition was scheduled for at least a month and a half to 2 months. They lived in tents more than in flats. Over the years, they became one of the strongest male-female climbing partnerships in world mountaineering, an extremely rare phenomenon in which marriage and the rope do not get in each other's way but work together. Marriage and the rope do not get in each other's way but work together. And that is precisely why their hardest ascents were not on the 8,000ers. Real professionals know this. Altitude is not always the main criterion. A difficult wall on a 6,000-meter peak can demand more skill than a standard route on an 8,000er. In 1997, Payne and Klima went to the north face of Changabong, a peak of 6,864 meters in the Indian Garhwal Himalaya. Changabong is considered one of the most beautiful and technically terrifying walls in the region. The team included Mick Fowler, Steve Sustad, Andy Cave, and Brendan Murphy, stars of British technical climbing. The route became one of the significant ascents of the 90s. In 1998, Payne went to Meru in India, another landmark peak for climbers in search not of altitude but of lines. This mountain would later be made famous by a documentary film, but by the end of the 90s, only those who knew what they were after were going there. In 2002, he climbed Island Peak in Nepal, 6,189 meters high. That is a more popular summit, often attempted by clients, and Payne came back there now as a guide. Their greatest joint achievement came in 2003. Payne and Klima traveled to Sichuan, southwestern China, the glaciers of the Daxue Shan Range. They chose the unclimbed north face of Mount Grosvenor, 6,376 meters. They climbed it in alpine style, without depots, without outside help. The first ascent was clean and quick. Later, in an interview, Payne called this climb one of the main achievements of his life. For him and Julianne, it was more than a summit. It was proof that after 20 years, the partnership still worked no worse than in Peru in 1986. After 20 years, the partnership still worked no worse than in Peru in 1986. But by then, Payne was no longer only a climber. In 2002, he was offered a new role, to become the first director of sport and development in the history of the UIAA. UIAA is the International Climbing and Mountaineering Federation, with its headquarters in Bern, overseeing all global mountaineering sport and relations with national federations. Payne moved to Switzerland, closer to Bern, and began to build an international program from scratch. That meant style high-level meetings, negotiations with the Olympic movement, budgets, paperwork, coordination with dozens of countries. He turned UIAA from a closed club of officials into a functioning international body. In parallel, he took on what truly moved him, the environment. Payne began to work with the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. In that same 2002, he organized a joint study of meltwater in the Everest region. Climbers, together with scientists, took measurements from glaciers that were retreating up the slopes year by year. This became one of the first tangible proofs that climate change had reached the Himalaya. Payne raised the issue of the Siachen Glacier, a zone of long-running conflict between India and Pakistan, where soldiers of both armies die not from bullets but from cold and avalanches. He wrote appeals, spoke at conferences, pushed for the glacier to be demilitarized. He succeeded in putting mountaineering on the UN climate change agenda and in getting mountain regions written into international documents. In 2005, he left UIAA. The reason was simple. He wanted to go back to where he had started. He became a full-time guide again and returned to his clients, to the Alps, to the work he was best at. The work he was best at was guiding. Payne and Klima settled in Switzerland, in an alpine town near Chamonix and Martigny. From here, it is easy to reach any route on the Mont Blanc Massif and to get across to the Italian side through the tunnel. For a guide, such a base is almost ideal. From 2005 onwards, he was once again a full-time working guide. Clients came from all over the world: British, Americans, Japanese, Scandinavians, Germans. He led groups up the Matterhorn, Monte Rosa, the summits of the Gran Paradiso. But his main route was Mont Blanc itself. Over the course of his career, he climbed Mont Blanc 112 times. That is a huge number, more than 100 attempts on the highest peak of Western Europe, 4,810 meters. Every ascent meant a sleepless night in a high mountain hut, a start in the dark, hour after hour up the snow slopes, a fight with the wind on the ridge. The classic route from the Cosmique's hut goes across 3 summits, first Mont Blanc du Tacoul, then a traverse, and the climb up Mont Maudit, and only after that comes Mont Blanc itself. This path is called the Three Monts route. It is considered more beautiful and more logical than the standard climb from the Guter hut, although, statistically, it is more dangerous. Avalanche slopes, seracs, long snow traverses, all on a single route. Payne climbed the Three Monts dozens of times. He knew every crevasse, every fixed rope, every dangerous turn. By 2012, he was one of the most experienced guides in the whole Mont Blanc Massif. He was valued for his composure, for his willingness to call off a climb in the poor conditions, for his ability to gauge a group's pace. Young guides saw him as a model for the profession. Older ones treated him as an equal. Young guides saw him as a model for the profession, and older ones treated him as an equal. And beyond his regular guiding work, Payne had another specialization that set him apart within the community. He was a certified avalanche safety instructor. An avalanche instructor is not just someone who knows how to behave in dangerous snow. It is someone who teaches others to read the mountains. Payne ran courses for young guides, for ski instructors, for rescue teams. He held several instructor qualifications and the right to issue credentials to other specialists. On his courses, he analyzed seracs, the huge ice towers that hang above routes. He explained why one avalanche comes down on a clear day while another fails to come down in a snowstorm. He taught how to distinguish a fresh wind-blown deposit from an old wind slab, and showed how temperature swings alter the structure of a snow layer. He ran practical sessions on real slopes in Scotland, in the Alps, and in the Canadian Rockies. In the professional community, his word was heeded without question. When Payne said that a route was not worth doing that day, his decision was not contested. When he said the risk was acceptable, he was trusted. In more than 30 years of practice, he had never had a single serious incident with clients caused by an avalanche. He often repeated a simple point: there are no safe routes in the mountains. There are only sound decisions. There is no such thing as a safe summit. There are conditions, there is the time of day, there is the state of the snow, there is the preparation of the group. All of this has to be read anew every time. The experience of the last time offers no guarantees. The mountain changes every night. By the season of 2012, he had more than 30 years of alpine practice behind him. He knew the north slope of Mont Maudit like a flat he had been living in for decades. And it was on that slope that he was fated to meet his last sunrise. It was on that slope that he was fated to meet his last sunrise. But before that, 2 clients came to him, whose story begins far from the Alps. In the summer of 2012, 2 men from the north of England appeared in Payne's schedule, Steve Barber, 47, and John Taylor, 48. Both lived in Upper Poppleton, a quiet village a few kilometers from York, one of the oldest cities in England. They were neighbors. Their houses stood on the same street, a few doors apart. Longtime friends who had been going into the mountains together for years. These were not young, reckless climbers. They were grown men, mid-career professionals, with families, jobs, and mortgages. They had come to the mountains late, but had taken them seriously. Over several seasons they had done the basic alpine routes. They had trained. They had learned to move as a rope team. By that summer, both had enough experience to tackle the demanding 3 months route with a guide. And this is where the detail begins that would later turn their story into something more than just an accident. Barber and Taylor turned their ascent into a charity project. They were raising money for St. Leonard's Hospice in York, an institution that helps people in the final stages of illness. The hospice runs on donations, and every pound matters to it. The friends sent letters to acquaintances, launched an online fundraising page, talked about it at work, in the pubs, at the football club, wherever people would listen. The idea was simple. They would climb Mont Blanc, and people would donate to the hospice for that. By the time they left for Chamonix, they had already raised a significant amount. When they hired Payne as their guide and locked themselves into his July schedule, everything looked as if this climb would have a good story and a good ending. Everything looked as if this climb would have a good story and a good ending. On the 11th of July, 2012, the three of them went up to the Refuge des Cosmiques. The hut stands at an altitude of 3,613 meters, on a ridge that overhangs the Géant Glacier. From here, the whole north face of Mont Maudit and the col leading to Mont Blanc can be clearly seen. The hut that evening was packed, a standard picture for mid-July, 40 or 50 people of various nationalities, with different levels of preparation and different plans for the next day. Some were going up Mont Blanc du Tacoul and coming back. Some for the full 3 months traverse. Others were spending the night there as an acclimatization step before another route. Inside the hut, there was a hum of voices, the smell of dinner, the clatter of alpine boots on the wooden floor, maps on the walls, summit records, the dinner schedule. Payne, Barber, and Taylor ate in the communal dining room, then went up to the dormitory. Around them were Germans, Swiss, Spaniards, a few more English, Danes, Italians. That night, around 28 people from different countries would set out on the 3 months. Among them were guides and clients and independent rope teams. An early start in a hot alpine season is an iron rule. During the day, the snow on the slopes softens and loses its bond. Seracs warm up and become less stable. You have to move by night, on frozen snow, and get past the dangerous places before the sun rises. Payne knew this schedule well. He had walked it dozens of times. One rope team after another began to gather around 2 or 3 in the morning. Breakfast on the move, a last kit check, crampons fastened in the dim glow of head torches. At 3 in the morning, the first rope team stepped out onto the glacier. The temperature -10, silence, only the crunch of snow under steel teeth. The sky still full dark and full of stars. More than 2 hours still before dawn. The sky still full dark and full of stars. More than 2 hours still before dawn. A chain of head torches stretched up the glacier. From below it looked like a slow stream of glowing points rising towards the black silhouettes of the summits. Rope teams moved close together, one after another. The distance between groups, a few tens of meters, sometimes less. The first hours passed to the rhythm, familiar to every Mont Blanc guide. The Géant Glacier, then the snowfields, then the climb up to Mont Blanc du Tacoul. That summit, 4,248 meters, comes first on the route. Parties traverse it, not always going over the peak itself. Then there is a short descent to the col, and the climb up Mont Maudit begins. It is here that the most dangerous section of the route begins. Above the slope along which the path runs rises a massive sérac, a multi-meter wall of ice hanging on a steep slope. From below, it looks almost motionless, but in reality, the glacier is in constant motion. Every few years, a piece of the sérac breaks off and comes crashing down. The name of the mountain, Mont Maudit, translates literally from French as cursed mountain. That was what they called Mont Blanc itself in the 18th century, while the neighboring summits still had no names. Later, when the massif was mapped, the name stayed with a separate peak, with this specific 4,000er, 4,465 meters high. Cursed, because its slopes are especially steep, its weather especially unpredictable, and its ice collapses especially frequent. By 5 in the morning, the first rope teams were approaching the traverse at an altitude of around 4,000 meters. This is the key spot on the route, a narrow strip of snow slope beneath the Sirac, about 100 meters long. It has to be crossed quickly. The groups were going in succession, keeping their intervals. Payne, Barber, and Taylor were among those already on the traverse or close to it. The sky in the east was beginning to gray. Dawn was a few minutes away. The sky in the east was beginning to gray. Dawn was a few minutes away. Rope teams were moving across the traverse, the beams of their head torches slowly losing their brightness in the incoming day. At around 4,000 meters, the air was still, the temperature steady at about -10. Everything looked stable. At around 5:25 in the morning, something collapsed high above. A massive block of ice, about 40 centimeters thick and several meters wide, broke off the Sirac and fell onto the slope. The impact of the block on the snow surface set off a chain reaction. The entire layer of old, compacted snow, the slab, tore loose and began to move down. The avalanche gathered speed instantly. It was around 100 meters long, around 2 meters deep. This was not a powder avalanche rushing through the air, but a dense mass of heavy snow and ice. It swept straight across the traverse, on which at that moment a chain of rope teams was strung out. The people had no time to react. Between the moment the crack sounded above and the moment the snow covered the path, only a few seconds passed. Rope teams were knocked off their feet and carried down. Ropes tangled, teams were torn apart. Some managed to shout, some did not. The dense mass covered the climbers in an instant and pressed them against the slope. The traverse turned into chaos. Overhead, shreds of cloud; below, a steep slope running down to the glacier. Some people were swept off the path and carried down the slope for dozens of meters. Some remained under the dense slab. The avalanche caught several rope teams at once within its radius. Not one, not two, but at least 4 or 5. It all happened in less than a minute. At the top, at the base of the Sirac, there remained a fresh fracture of ice, where the block had sheared off. Lower down, across the traverse, there was a continuous field of snow and blocks of ice under which dozens of people had ended up. The distress call went out to the rescuers' frequency almost immediately. In Chamonix, it was received by the PGHM, the High Mountain Gendarmerie, the special unit that operates across the whole Mont Blanc Massif. The duty shift scrambled helicopters and teams from the Italian side in Courmayeur. The first helicopter was airborne within minutes. Over Chamonix, it was still early twilight, but in the Alps by 5:30 in the morning, there was already enough light at altitude to conduct a search. The aircraft went straight to the north face of Mont Maudit. The crew saw the fresh avalanche track and began to circle above it. More helicopters joined the first ones, from PGHM and from the Italian Emergency Service. The rescuers landed on the slope one after another. The work went at a brutal pace. In such a mass of snow, every minute counts. Rescue dogs have a chance in such an operation, but the density of the slab and the size of the avalanche required dozens of people on the ground. 14 people were pulled out from under the snow alive. Many had fractures, frostbite, serious injuries. They were lifted out by winch and transported to hospitals in Chamonix and Salanches. Some were evacuated by helicopter directly from the slope, others from an intermediate assembly point on the glacier. 9 people could not be saved. They were found at varying depths within the slab, from 0.5 meter to 2 meters. According to the rescue service's findings, some had died at the moment of the release itself, others before the teams could dig them out. Among the dead were 3 British citizens, including Roger Payne. 2 Swiss climbers, 2 Germans, and 2 Spaniards did not come home from that route. In all, in a single avalanche, in 1 minute, the Mont Blanc Massif lost 9 people from 4 countries. For European mountaineering of the 21st century, this became the deadliest avalanche in the history of Mont Blanc. For European mountaineering of the 21st century, this became the deadliest avalanche in the history of Mont Blanc. And for Britain, this avalanche struck an especially heavy blow. 3 of its citizens died in a single morning on a single slope. The first name, Roger Payne. He was 55 years old. In 4 days' time, he would have marked his 56th birthday. The climbing community heard the news by lunchtime the same day. First rumors in Chamonix, then official statements from PGHM, then press releases from BMC and UIAA. Beside him were his clients, Steve Barber and John Taylor, two neighbors from Upper Poppleton, two families in York who by noon would learn that their husbands, fathers, brothers would not be coming home from an alpine climb on which they had been raising money for a hospice. The news reached York the same day. Local ITV television ran a special report on the evening news. The next morning's papers carried photographs of two smiling men in alpine kit taken before their departure. Beneath the same photographs, they were raising money for St. Leonard's. And then something happened that rarely happens in such stories. Instead of the fundraising stopping, it accelerated. St. Leonard's Hospice put out an appeal not to halt the donations, asking that the memory of the men be honored by continuing the cause they had given their money for. Over the next 24 hours, dozens of new transfers came into the charity campaign's account. More than 88 people transferred money in a single night. The total raised exceeded £2,393 within just the first hours after the announcement. The story of Barber and Taylor proved enough to make strangers across England open their wallets. For a hospice they would never be inside. The story of Barber and Taylor proved enough to make strangers across England open their wallets. But for one person, this disaster was not an abstraction and not an occasion for a gesture. It was a complete personal loss. Julianne Klima learned of her husband's death within hours of the avalanche. The official information, calls from friends, the first messages on the news feeds, all converged on a single point. 26 years of life together ended on the morning of the 12th of July, 2012. 26 years. That is not just a marriage. It is dozens of expeditions from Peru to the Himalaya, the first ascent of the south face of Rurek, K2 in 93, the north face of Changabong in 97, Mount Grosvenor in 2003, their own route from dawn to decadence on Mont Blanc in 2004. It is a shared flat in Switzerland, a shared archive of photographs, shared notebooks filled with route descriptions. Now she was on her own. With this archive, with routes to which there was no one left to return together, with a room holding the unpacked gear of her husband, the same gear he had taken on expeditions spanning 24 years. The climbing community reacted at once. Dave Turnbull, CEO of BMC, made a public statement. He called Payne one of the most energetic and respected climbers in the country. UIAA issued an address the same day. Payne had been not just a member of the Federation, he had built its modern face. The International Federation of Mountain Guides Associations, IFMGA, decided to grant Payne posthumous honorary membership. In the world of mountain guides, that is an exceptionally rare honor. Only a handful receive it in the organization's entire history. Normally, membership in IFMGA is the product of years of work, exams, and committee service. Posthumous honorary membership is the recognition that a person gave the profession more than it had time to give back to him. For Julianne, all these honors were cold comfort, but for the climbing world, they fixed one thing. Payne had not been just a victim. He had been a figure. For the climbing world, all this fixed one thing. Payne had not been just a victim. He had been a figure. But, along with the official statements honoring his memory, PGHM and French avalanche experts began their own investigation. Cold, technical, stripped of emotion. They went up to the slope in the first 24 hours after the disaster. They measured the fracture of the Sirac, assessed the thickness of the slab, studied the track of the slide. They photographed the snow profile, took snow samples, analyzed its layered structure. Within a few days, the investigators had pieced together a picture. In their conclusion, the primary cause was the collapse of the Sirac hanging above the slope. A large block of ice separated under the action of the glacier's internal stresses. The movement of the glacier is constant but slow, and at some moment, the accumulated stress exceeds the strength of the bond. The block shears off, falls onto the slope, and triggers the slab, a mass of old, compacted snow that had already accumulated enough weight to pull away from its base. The experts stressed, such events cannot be predicted precisely. General risk can be assessed by temperature, by precipitation, by the time of day, by the state of the slope. But the exact moment a sérac breaks off is known to no one. Even an experienced guide who has done the route 100 times has no tools to foresee that morning. The Three Monts route was not closed after this disaster. It remains one of the most popular routes on Mont Blanc. Every summer season, hundreds of climbers go up it, both with guides and independently. The statistics show that this is at once one of the most beautiful and one of the most dangerous paths to the summit. After 2012, the discussion of safety on the Mont Blanc Massif became a constant theme in alpine journals and at professional conferences. There were proposals to close certain sections in hot weather, to make hut registration mandatory, to increase avalanche monitoring. Some of these measures were adopted, others were not. The séracs on the north face of Mont Maudit are still in place. They are not going anywhere, and every summer their movement will create new risks. The séracs on the north face of Mont Maudit are still in place. They are not going anywhere, and every summer their movement will create new risks. And in that lies the main lesson the climbing world draws from the 12th of July, 2012. Mont Maudit, the cursed mountain. The name given to the peak in the 18th century ceased in 2012 to be an abstraction. For one season, it rang literally. 9 people, 4 countries, 1 morning. A mass slide of that scale on this slope had not been seen for decades. Mont Blanc and its massif remain the deadliest cluster of summits in Western Europe. By various counts, several thousand climbers have died here over the entire history of ascents. Every season takes more, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in groups. The 4,810 meters of the main summit do not look dangerous beside the 8,000ers of the Himalaya, but it is precisely that accessibility that makes the massif particularly deadly. Both trained professionals and people who had no business being there come to these mountains. Payne's story became part of the global conversation about risk in the mountains. An avalanche safety instructor, one of the finest guides of his generation, a man who knew the north face of Mont Maudit like a flat he lived in, died in an avalanche on that very face. And that is not a paradox. It is a precise reflection of what he himself used to say in his lectures. There are no safe routes in the mountains. There are only sound decisions, which sometimes prove helpless in the face of chance. St. Leonard's Hospice received record donations in memory of Barber and Taylor. Their fundraiser did not break off with their deaths. It outlived them. The Yorkshire village of Upper Poppleton received a lesson in how a climb can become the final act of care for others. Julie Ann Klima continued to work as a guide, keeping alive the legacy of their shared roots. And the Mont Blanc Massif would appear in the news many more times, but with different names. The cursed mountain is waiting for new sunrises.